It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Today we have a very special guest, Douglas Valentine. I've been trying to get him for a very long time. And he's an author of several books. The main one we'll be discussing today is the Pheonix program, which is about the CIA program in Saigon, basically torturing civilians. But also, too, I want to discuss with him his other books, The Strength of the Pack, The Personalities, Politics, and Espionage Intrigues That Shape the DEA, The Strength of the Wolf, Secret History of America's War on Drugs, and a couple other books, too. He's also written some on the Hotel Taliban.
Taliban's good. My father called it Taliban, but there's a lot of ways to pronounce it, so that's fine.
Okay, Doug is smiling at me as I try to pronounce Taliban here. So, Doug, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell us about yourself?
I'm 65. My first book came out in 1984. It was the Hotel Taliban, and it's about my father, who was a prisoner of war in the Philippines in a Japanese camp in World War. And that book opened a lot of doors for me. After I finished that book, I wanted to write a second book. I wanted to write it about the Vietnam War. And I decided to write it about the Pheonix program because at that point, there hadn't been any books written about Pheonix. And that seemed to me like a big gap in all the histories of the Vietnam War because Pheonix was actually the strategy that the CIA and the embassy settled upon to actually win the war. And of course, the book talks all about it. But Hotel Taliban was opened a lot of doors for me because it was about my father, who was a combat veteran and fought in New Guinea and the Philippines. A lot of people who probably wouldn't normally have spoken to me decided to give me interviews once they read that book. And the most important person was William Colby. I sent Colby a copy of Hotel Taliban, and he read it, and he said, okay, I'll talk to you. Come on down. He was, Colby had been the director of Central Intelligence from 1973 to 1975 during the Watergate hearings and all sorts of controversy. He'd been a career CIA officer. He was in the OSS and pretty much basically went into the CIA right after World War II. He served in Italy for quite a number of years. He became the station chief in Saigon in 1959, and was and after being in Vietnam for a couple of years, he became head of the CIA's Far East Asia Division, which oversaw all the CIA operations in Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Vietnam, and those parts of the world. He was pretty much the authority and the moving force in the CIA's policies in Southeast Asia, and had a lot to do with CIA policy in Vietnam. Was also the person most closely associated with the Pheonix program. There were congressional hearings on Pheonix in 1970 and 1971, and again in 73. And Colby was the face of the CIA. He was the person that testified at those congressional investigations. And he gave a real stirring defense of Pheonix before Congress. And of course, it was all very carefully stage managed. But in the process, he became the person most closely linked to Pheonix. So when I wanted to write a book about it, I first went to him. I had no expectations that anything would happen, but he liked the Hotel Taliban, and he invited me down to Washington, where he was then, this is 1984, a lawyer working for a big lobbying firm on K Street, and And I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, fine, I'll help you. There haven't been any books written about Vietnam and about Pheonix, and I'd like to see one written. And he started introducing me to senior CIA officials who'd worked for him in the Pheonix program in Vietnam. And that's just...
One second. Didn't he, if the guy was the head of the CIA, didn't he do a little background check on you and see what your politics were? Check you out first?
Well, you'd be surprised. And things have changed since 1984. And I should add, things have changed since Colby trusted me and spilled beans to me. I mean, the CIA is not about to make that mistake anymore. But one of the things that's unique about my book about the Pheonix program and my research into the Pheonix program is that I carried Colby's imprimatur. I mean, he gave me his backing, and people would senior CIA officers actually thought I was in the CIA because I came from nowhere. I had no journalistic background, and Colby would call him up and say, yeah, talk to the guy. And I'd show up in their door wearing my blazer and tie and a nice white shirt and my hair combed and putting on a nice, presentation. And they just thought I had to be some CIA guy doing a history of Pheonix for Colby. And they told me everything. And I got a lot of the information down on tape. And if people are serious students of the Pheonix program, they should go to a website called Crypticome, where they put up all the taped interviews I did, which were eventually digitized when CDs and DVDs came out decades after I recorded everything on a Radio Shack tape recorder. And they're all up there for anybody in the world who wants to listen to, like, my interview with Colby or with Evan Parker, who was a CIA officer who had actually been with Colby in the OSS and worked for Colby for 20 years. And he was the first director of the Pheonix program. My interviews with him are up on the internet. My interviews with a guy named John Muldoon, who ran the interrogation program, which you referenced. Starting in 1964, the CIA built an interrogation center in every province in Vietnam. There were 44 of them. They also built massive interrogation centers in each of the regional capitals, Da Nang and Nha Trang and My Tho in the Delta, which we became actually the models for all the black sites around the world in the War on Terror and Guantanamo. I talked with Muldoon. They called him Picadune, Province Interrogation Center Chief, Picadune from Muldoon. I talked with the head of the covert action programs in Vietnam, a guy that Colby introduced me to, a guy named Thomas Donahue. So not only did I write about the Pheonix program, but through Colby, I was able to write a book about how actually the CIA was organized and operated in South Vietnam, which nobody has ever done before and nobody had ever done afterwards.
Now, was Colby being compensated in any way for helping you with this book?
No, not at all. And I actually went down and saw him a second time about a year later, and everything was going smoothly. The people that I was talking to were very happy with me. I didn't have any attitudes. Because my father was a veteran and had been in combat, I understood the stresses that these guys were working under. I didn't have any judgments about them doing soldierly kinds of things. And if there's something you need to understand about the CIA, it's basically a military organization with people wearing mufti, dressed up as civilians, but it's organized like a military organization where you have a superior and he tells you what to do and you salute and you go do it. And it involves armed conflict, and espionage, of course, is Very dangerous business. If you get caught, you get killed, or worse. So I understood how to deal with guys, Navy SEALs. I could go into a room with a bunch of Navy SEALs. I could go into a room with a bunch of Green Berets and get drunk with them and make their guns safe, so they wouldn't go shooting up the place, which they're prone to do. I could talk to CIA officers also about things that they were interested in. This guy I interviewed, Evan Parker, was studying to be a deacon, was already a deacon in his church at the time I interviewed him at his home in Rockville, Maryland. And he was very interested in Welsh poetry. And we sat and we discussed Welsh poetry for an hour and the Bible for an hour before we got into Pheonix. It's an interesting story. We went up to this little study he had, which was a reconverted bedroom where his son had a bedroom. He had converted it into a little library, and he had a whole bunch of documents on this little coffee table. And we sat there and talked for an hour, and he got to like me, and he said, "I'm going to go downstairs and make us some tea, Doug. I'll be back in about 15 or 20 minutes." And he winks and walks out of the room, and there's this stack of documents there on the table. And I open up the first document, and it's a roster of all the people who were initially on the Pheonix staff in Saigon in July of 1967, with their name and their rank and if they're a CIA guy, it identifies them as a CIA guy. And there's like 25 or 30 names on this list with their military ID numbers and ways for me to identify them. And I furiously just start writing down all these names. The guy is basically giving me an organizational chart of Pheonix with all the names of the major players when it was created. And my hand's getting tired, and about 15 minutes later, he yells up from downstairs, "Doug, I have the cookies and the tea ready, and I'm coming up." And, I put my notebook away, and I close up this document, and I sit back in the chair, and he comes in, and he says, here's the tea, or do you have any questions for me? And that's basically the way it was for the first 2 years of my doing the research on the Pheonix program. And I never said to anybody, I never made judgments, I never accused them of killing anybody, I wasn't aggressive, I was just there to get the organizational and administrative and operational facts. And because of my presentation and my non-threatening way and my understanding of soldiers, and because Colby said he's okay, everybody told me everything.
Yeah.
And it was just amazing to me, and I just kept wondering, when's the dream going to end?
Yeah, I bet. And imagine, too, if you had an iPhone, and you could have, nowadays, you could have snapped up all that stuff. But let me ask you this. Now, when you were interviewing these men, were they openly admitting to torture procedures and stuff like that?
Well, I wasn't asking these guys if that's what happened, okay? However, in the course of describing what they had to do, these things would come out. Some guy, eventually I got down to the talking with CIA officers in the field. I got out of headquarters, and I started talking to the guys that actually ran the counterterror teams, the PRU teams, which were the hit teams, composed of mercenaries. And I started talking to the guys that ran these interrogation centers, and where people were brought in and given every form of torture imaginable. And again, I didn't say to them, were people, did you torture people in there? I mean, you're not going to get a response from somebody if you accuse them of conducting war crimes. However, they would say things like, well, the CIA would say, well, I couldn't be at the interrogation all the time, center all the time, so, I had to hire a guy. And he came from, he'd been, for example, a police detective in New York City for 20 years, and then he retired, and we hired him because he knew criminal investigation methods. And he was a good guy to have run this interrogation center. He knew how to write reports. And, reports came back to me that sometimes he was doing naughty things, and then But all the information eventually came spilling out, and all the facts eventually came spilling out. But I never had to really ask about it. And of course, eventually I got down to the level of the sergeants and the corporals and the people who were actually doing all these things, the guys who were fragging their officers and were horrified by the absolute difference between what the stated policy of Pheonix was, which, Colby, when he got to Congress, said it was our intention that no innocent person would ever be arrested and nobody would ever be tortured, and everybody in Congress heaves a big sigh of relief because the director of Central Intelligence has just assured them that anything that happened was accidental. From the guys, the sergeants and corporals and the people the young, very new CIA guys who were running the program in the field, who said, man, we were pounding dowels into their ears. We were, chopping off their fingers. We were, we were cutting their heads off and putting them on stakes outside of villages, So I was able to contrast the operational realities of the Pheonix program with the bureaucratic intentions and the structure that was set up, and able to actually map every stage from the stated policy to the operational realities to show how the program was set up to actually enable all these atrocities that were committed. Because, like, one very famous CIA officer said to me, a guy named Lucien Conein, and if any of your listeners are familiar with the CIA and the history of the CIA, they probably heard of Lucien Conein, but he'd been in Vietnam, started in 1954, and was just there for years and years, and knew all the major politicians and generals and stuff. And Conein, when I was at his house, he said to me, Pheonix was a good blackmail scheme for the central government. If you don't do what I want, you're VC. And if you're VC, you can be tortured and killed and have your family wiped out and everything else, because the VC is the enemy. And, just like in the war on terror, it's nothing for the United States to drop a bomb on a village if they think that there's some Al Qaeda guy there. I mean, to go out and use a drone to hit a wedding or a funeral where they think some high-ranking Al Qaeda guy is hanging out. Those are the tactics that began in the Pheonix program, and the current war on terror, as it's fought, was actually developed and perfected in the Pheonix program in Vietnam. And it's the way that the United States now fights all its wars around the world and polices its empire.
Now, it seems that back in Vietnam, that this would be an opportunity for corruption, for people to make money off of this, by if you could have that kind of control over the local governments.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, the Minister of Interior of the South Vietnamese government would say, we're doing everything we can to prevent corruption in this program and to make sure that we have only the best trained and most, secret policemen and military security people in this program. And yet, when it got down into the provinces and into the districts, it was completely different, because 90% of the officials of the South Vietnamese government who were out in the provinces outside of Saigon, in order to stay alive, in order to run their operations, they had to cut deals with the Viet Cong so the Viet Cong wouldn't come and assassinate them and their families. And the Viet Cong, the senior Viet Cong officials, had deals with all the top government officials in the provinces and the districts, so that, it was only people who couldn't afford to pay protection who were getting scarfed up by Pheonix. And you didn't have to be guilty. If an informant for the CIA was in business, in the construction business in My Tho, and he didn't like some guy was trying to muscle in on his construction business and meet out. Well, this guy would say, trans with the VC, and the CIA didn't need any corroborating evidence. The testimony of an anonymous informant was enough to get somebody put on the Pheonix blacklist. And so corruption was just, the levels of corruption went beyond anything you can imagine. And of course,
you can imagine.
Of course, the whole Pheonix just became synonymous with terror.
Yeah, because if these CIA guys down there have this money machine, why would they ever want this war to end? They're down there like kings. In
the internal memos within the CIA, you never find anybody talking about negotiating. You never hear top CIA officers saying, well, instead of wiping out half the people of South Vietnam, we should be talking with their leaders and trying to negotiate some sort of, peace or agreement. They made it, there were the laws in South Vietnam, which are, again, the model for the wars, the laws in the United States, starting with the Patriot Act, very draconian laws that really severely starts restricting your civil liberties. It was a national security crime, and you could be arrested and put in one of these interrogation centers if you were advocating peace, because that was said to be collaborating with terrorism. So they actually made being for peace or being neutral a crime against the state of South Vietnam, and the Pheonix teams could go out and kidnap you and kill your family and put you in detention for the rest of your life if you advocated peace or were neutral.
Are you familiar with Dave McGowan and the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and the other book Program to Kill?
I've heard of McGowan, but I don't know. I don't think I read the book.
Because he has a theory that because we had this Pheonix program going on over there in Southeast Asia, and then after the war, suddenly here in the United States, we had all these serial killers and all this other type of terror activity going on. Do you see any connection to that kind of thing?
Well, it's hard to gather any factual evidence on that. I certainly haven't done an investigation into it, but and I say this just because I've known about these things. What the CIA studied, and so does the military. They put more money into research on human behavior than they do on weapon systems. And through the 50s and the 60s, the CIA was deeply involved in the MK Ultra program, in which they were trying to learn how to modify human behavior and create people into assassins and murderers. And, they said around 1971 that all that ended. Well, if they were doing it in the 50s and 60s, you can believe they're still doing it in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and now in the 20s, and that they've only gotten better at it, and that their ability to control individuals, along with the news, has only vastly increased.
Has there any evidence of anybody coming out of the Pheonix program and then becoming a serial killer here in the United States that you know of?
Not to my knowledge, okay. But then again, I'm not familiar with all the people that were, in the Pheonix program. And I would have to qualify that statement by saying a lot of our current government leaders came out of the Pheonix program, and they certainly did a good job of murdering an awful lot of people around the world. They might not have been serial killers here in the United States, but the people who adopted the Pheonix program, organizational structure and operating procedures, who went on to run the military and the CIA, in my opinion, are serial killers of the highest order who have put the lessons they learned from the Pheonix program to horrific use around the world in the decades afterwards.
Yeah, skipping ahead a bit, like to Abu Ghraib, right? I'd heard some stories that one of the things they were doing is kidnapping children, and they were raping young boys in front of their parents, in front of their families. Have you heard those stories?
About Pheonix?
No, in Abu Ghraib in Iraq.
Yeah. I just heard that a couple of days ago. Yeah, and there's the actual intent of the Pheonix program was to terrorize the civilian population into submission. And there was actually a bunch of articles written about it, starting in late 1969 and 1970, 1971. I mean, obviously, in these articles in the mainstream press, even including Newsweek, mostly in publications like the Village Voice, talked about many similar things going on in Vietnam and how it was all designed, again, like I said just a few minutes ago, to prevent average people from supporting the Viet Cong, from being neutral, or from advocating peace. Again, like Conin said, if you don't do what I want, you're VC. And the same lesson was applied in Iraq. If you didn't support the Americans, you're the enemy, and American soldiers could do anything they wanted to.
Are you familiar with the name Michael Aquino?
I've heard that name, and people have sent me some stuff that he's written, and he was he might have been in the Pheonix program. I think he was in Vietnam, but he wrote a lot of he wrote some articles about psychological warfare, I believe, and but I myself never interviewed him. Okay. And I've never had anything to do with him. I don't know even if he's still alive, but I have heard of him, yes.
Yeah, he's still alive. He's still alive. In fact, he does a little radio these days. He's making a little tour. And
yeah. Somebody should go out and talk to him.
I don't know if I want to do that.
I found that, in researching my book that quite often people like him want to get things off their chest. So maybe there's some things he wants to get off his chest. But if I was still researching Pheonix, I'd certainly go talk to him.
I guess if we're looking at your progression here, okay, you did the book about your father, and that tipped you off. You got a hold of Colby. I love that story. But then I guess next, because of the drug running that went on in Vietnam and South America, that's how you got involved in this investigating. So tell us about, now, were these same Pheonix guys the ones that were running drugs out of Vietnam?
Well, when I was doing the book on Pheonix, and I spent 4 years researching it, I kept hearing, stories about Laos and the Golden Triangle, and how, because I was researching the CIA, and these CIA guys would rotate out of South Vietnam into Laos, into Thailand. They were just, they'd do a 2-year tour one place and a 2-year tour another place. I kept hearing about all the drugs, all the heroin and opium that was pouring out of the Golden Triangle, which is this area of Laos, Burma, and Thailand, into South Vietnam, and how one of the ways the CIA got all the top Vietnamese politicians and generals to go along with Pheonix was by making sure that they had a steady supply of heroin coming out of the Golden Triangle, and that they could sell and distribute in their own area of operations. Like the commanding general of 4 Corps, the Delta, everybody knew that he owned the franchise for drug trafficking, for selling marijuana, heroin, and opium in the Delta, and because he was the big shot, and like every other enterprise that went on in South Vietnam. Everybody kicked back a little bit up the way. I mean, the street guy had to kick back to his district. I mean, it just went up the chain of command, and these generals were making millions of dollars and squirreling it away in Swiss accounts so that when the war was over, they could run away and live in Paris for the rest of their lives. And I kept hearing all the details about it, but it wasn't the book on Pheonix, so I didn't want to put any of that in the story of Pheonix. But I started saving it up, knowing that was going to be my next book. And to make it even more, to draw an even closer connection, a number of the guys who were in the CIA guys who were in the Pheonix program in South Vietnam actually went into the DEA starting around 1970 and 1971. As the war in South Vietnam was winding down, the CIA needed a place to put all the paramilitary soldiers that they had hired to fight in Vietnam, but the war wasn't that big anymore, so they were having this reduction of force, and they had this obligation to these guys that they had hired, and they started dumping them into the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which preceded the DEA. And I had met a couple of these guys, and I knew what was going on, and I knew that the actual Pheonix was set up on what's called the systems approach, which meant that it was computerized. All the lists of the Viet Cong were computerized in Saigon. The guys that were running Pheonix in the field were writing up, blacklists, and they were sending the list to Saigon, and everything was computerized. And the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs was reorganizing itself that same way on the systems approach, doing the same thing with all the heroin addicts and people who, suspects who were thought to be growing or distributing marijuana or cocaine or anything else. They were systematizing all that stuff and computerizing it. And all these guys from the CIA were very familiar with this way of operating. And there were dozens of them, close to 100, were brought into the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs starting in 1971. And it was the beginning of the militarization, the paramilitarization of the police forces, both federal and state and local in the United States during this period of time. And it just kept on going and going through like 1974 into 1975 when the war ended, Vietnam War ended. But by that time, law enforcement organizations across the United States, most notably the DEA, but also state police forces and local police forces, had been infiltrated with a cadre of Army, Navy, Air Force, CIA veterans who brought all these theories and ideas about how to fight counterinsurgency warfare into the law enforcement branch of the United States government. And that's what my books are about, and also, of course, about the really close relationship between the DEA and its predecessor organizations, including the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and before that, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which you may remember, which existed up until 1968. Those organizations were intimately tied to the CIA, and I discuss all of that at length in these books. The first book is specifically about it's called The Strength of the Wolf, the secret history of America's war on drugs, is about the Bureau of Narcotics, which was created in 1930 and existed until 1968, and was run most of the time by a guy named Harry Anslinger. And Anslinger was actually one of the people that helped create the CIA. The Bureau of Narcotics was, in the 1950s and 1960s, its overseas agents were more likely to be CIA agents working undercover than there were to be narcotic agents. And Anslinger actually helped create the CIA and the OSS and had incredibly intimate relationships with it. And all that stuff is discussed in those books. If you don't mind, I'll give you a little anecdote.
Sure.
In 1994, I went to interview a man named Steve Green, with an E at the end of the Green, who was then the acting director of the DEA in 1994. And he didn't want to do the interview. And but his public affairs chief, a guy named Bill Rusamente, knew what I was up to, and he wanted me to interview Green. So I went down to Pentagon City, where the DEA had this really big facility, its headquarters, and it was different times. I had luggage with me, and Rusamente came down the elevator and into the lobby and said, "Nah, he's okay, come on up." You can't do that kind of stuff anymore. And with all my, my luggage, I get into because I had to go I had just flown in and I had to go someplace else. And we go up the elevator to this big, massive suite of offices where which that in the government, the director has a big, huge office, as big as a CVS, and the public affairs guy is outside, and he decides who's going to get to see the director. And Rusamente sits me down, and he says, "I'm going to tell you something, and if you ever tell anybody, I'm going to deny I said it. But the CIA knew you were coming here today. They called me up a couple of days ago, and they said, don't see Valentine. He screwed us over with the Pheonix program book, and the only reason he's doing this book on the DEA and the FBN is to get at us. Don't talk to him." Rusamente looks at me, and he's sitting down on the couch next to me. He looks me in the eye and says, "What do you got to say about that?" I said, "Well, Bill, I'm doing a book about the DEA. But if in the course of my research, I find out that the CIA is somehow involved in international narcotic trafficking, I'm going to write about it." And he gives me a big smile, and he says, "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." And in those days, there was still some tension between the DEA and the CIA because it was well known, as Gary Webb and others, including myself, have made painfully clear that the CIA was sabotaging most of the main cases that the DEA was trying to make. And when they didn't sabotage them, they would take control of them because the CIA is able to actually vet and control every informant that the DEA has overseas. In 1975, the DEA had to start sending the CIA a list of every one of its informants overseas so that the CIA could vet them. And so the CIA can do whatever it wants to any DEA, any operation around the world, simply because it controls all the informants. And a lot of these informants are bankers, arms dealers, they're policemen in foreign police forces. So very early on, the CIA actually took control of the DEA in a way that, and again, the same way I explained Pheonix, I explain in my books. Gary Webb never got into this kind of detail, but I explain all that kind of actual bureaucratic, technical stuff, which enables the CIA to control drug dealing worldwide. And so I write what I wrote those books about, and it basically shows how the CIA controls law enforcement.
You might almost call it market research.
Yeah. Well, in a way, yeah, and it's a good analogy because most of these things, including the war on drugs, are business enterprises. Yeah. And the business of America is business. And all of these, the Pheonix program was designed to make sure that people who supported American policy in South Vietnam prospered and got business deals and were able to run like the construction firm that I'm telling you about. You didn't want a communist running and contrary to public belief, communists are glad to have construction businesses and make a little money, but they opposed American policy, so you can't have that. Well, it's the same thing all over the world. And whether it's in Colombia, where the United States wants to make sure that its politicians get elected and its industrialists get to control a particular business or industry. The war on drugs is just a way of putting the arm on these people and making sure that they abide by by American policies, or else, the federal agents come swooping in, and the people that they're in liaison with the security forces in these foreign countries. So it is a good analogy, because basically it all comes down to who's going to make money and who isn't.
Yeah. Now you mentioned Gary Webb. Things didn't turn out too good for him. Have you experienced any of that same kind of harassment or kind of agitation in your life?
Well, I knew Gary a little bit, and he had some, personal problems.
Okay.
And if you have some personal problems in your life, the stress can make the glass go from half empty to half full. And if you're going to do this business, you got to get used to walking around with a glass that you're never quite sure whether it's half empty or half full. And it doesn't bother me. And all the harassments, it was not unusual for my wife and I to get a call at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and some guy would say, "I'm going to burn your house down." And my wife would say, take a number and get in line. Mm-hmm. It's like, it never bothered us because it wasn't actually, my car, the brakes on my car were never tampered with. There was, as far as I know, nothing like that ever happened. There were no actual attempts on me. There was lots of harassment. The big thing that happened to me is that my books were suppressed.
Yeah.
So I never got credit for being the guy who exposed the CIA in Vietnam. The mainstream press, which enabled and continues to enable every CIA operation. Every CIA guy that I was talking with when I was senior CIA guy was telling me how Morley Safer or Bill Plant or some other guy who was a journalist in Vietnam was coming to his office every week with a bottle of scotch, and they were discussing all the CIA secrets. But none of these guys ever spilled the beans, and then none of this stuff would ever have happened if the media hadn't covered it up. Well, the media hated me as much as the CIA for explaining all these things and telling the role of the mainstream media, CBS, ABC. In covering for the CIA all over the world, because they're part of this business venture. They want to make money too, and so they support the CIA, knowing that their businesses will thrive if they do so. So the only real damage I ever suffered was having my book suppressed. But quite frankly, I knew that was going to happen.
Yeah,
I had no illusions that I was going to get away with this, scot-free.
Yeah, we had Henry Vincent on the show, who wrote the Confessions of a D.C. Madam, and so that's the other way they get these reporters too. They bring them to these parties in D.C., then they tape them, because he mentioned some pretty big names in the media.
I've talked about the CIA and the media as being complicit, but of course the people who oversee both of those institutions are politicians. The CIA is often cast as some sort of rogue element that's somehow conspiring without the knowledge of the president and Congress, but everything they do is signed off on by your elected officials, who are the biggest thieves in the world. And when you talk about business ventures, the minute you become a senator or a congressman, the first thing the majority leader or the minority leader tells you is, you're now in the club, and if you want to do well, just keep your mouth shut and do what we tell you. And your kids will be good. You won't have to take out loans that put your kids in debt for the rest of their lives. Your kids will get to go to college and it won't cost you anything, and they'll be set for life, and just do what you're told, and everything's fine. And and part of that is signing off on all the CIA's covert operations and knowing that the press is going to protect you. Okay, that's our democracy in terms of operational realities as opposed to stated policies. It's the same thing I was telling you earlier.
But now, are you concerned at all that we might start seeing the same kind of torture interrogation going on here within the States? in the future?
Well, I think it's inevitably heading that way.
Yeah.
Obviously, our foreign policy is a lot different than our domestic policy, but they're very, as the world becomes more of as communications and transportation and all the internet make it one big global village, and as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, inevitably our ruling class is going to start treating the other 99.999% as Viet Cong, as potential insurgents and guerrillas. And while it hasn't gotten to that point yet, it's inevitably trending in that direction. Unless, of course, there's some kind of revolution here in the United States and all the corrupt politicians are kicked out and the media is, like the Yankees, like they used to say, break up the Yankees, unless they can break up the media and make it into 1,000 independent networks instead of 3 or 4 highly centralized outlets that control every word that we see. Unless the people can organize themselves in some sort of grassroots way and take the country back, it's inevitably trending in that direction.
But, even in alternative media, like where we are right now today on this show, so many, I'm sure you've been on a lot of shows. I listened to some of your YouTube stuff. But as long as we have these hosts talking about Obama is a communist and Obama's a socialist, and he's a Muslim, he's a terrorist that snuck into the White House, you have alternative media people with those kind of whacked out theories, and Jade Helm and tunnels under Walmart and all this stuff.
Well, and this is it's a problem, and the problem is. We have MSNBC, which is the Democratic Party news outlet, and we have Fox, which is the Republican outlet, and that's it. And you really can't find anywhere, other than in some small independent places, anything that tries to be rational and nonpartisan. And it's really stressing out the way Gary Webb got stressed out. It's really stressing out people because they feel torn and conflicted and eventually they just throw up their hands and say, well, I'm an Israeli and all Arabs are bad, or I'm an Arab and all Israelis are bad. And there's no attempt to actually rationally approach issues the way, to some extent, and they were rationally approached by guys like Walter Cronkite or something back in the, where at least a pretense was made of objectivity. The whole pretense of objectivity has vanished. And with it, any kind of rational discourse, it's just the anvil chorus. And that's not good. But I have there's no way I can offer up any alternatives. As an individual, I'm as frustrated as anybody else by that state of affairs.
Yeah, because you were saying before how you're from New York. Remember, like on Sunday afternoon in New York, you had Like It Is.
Yeah. No, I even remember Edward R. Murrow, going into little towns and villages where people were poor and saying things like, how can we as an America, feel good about ourselves if we're allowing people who aren't doing well to prosper, to at least get a start. Nowadays, if you're poor, you hate it. People like, Fox News or even NBC, saying, well, how come these people don't get with the program? What's wrong with them? I mean, there's racial problems in the United States, and yet nobody ever talks about racism.
Yeah.
They'll talk about Ferguson as well, people are denied an opportunity. That's the best they'll get, or we need better community relations. But nobody ever says, racism is ingrained in the society and we have to do something to change that because they're afraid to offend. And I'm one of them. I have all the prejudices. If I'm in the inner city and I walk by 4 or 5 black guys on a corner, I react. I get nervous. I'm as bad as anybody else, but it's not talked about, the ingrained racism in the United States. And until you can actually have an Edward R. Murrow, or until you can actually tell it like it is, you can't solve it. But it's all become like a reality TV show. And advertisers the people who are making money off the networks selling products, again, it's the business venture, don't want anything that controversial or anything that they feel might offend the sensibilities of sensitive Americans. Americans, when you are really very sensitive about these sort of things, and they don't really want to face up to them.
Let me hit you with this. If you look at the Boston bombing, right, there seems to be some CIA characters floating around in that situation. What do you make of something like that?
Well, there has to be. It's impossible for it not to be. And like I think people must now be well aware that almost every, the FBI certainly has a much bigger presence in something like the Marathon bombing. But since 2001 and even before, almost every act of terrorism in the United States, there was an FBI undercover informant who was provoking all these people to go do these things. And this is not new FBI standard operating procedure. I mean, their job is to infiltrate potential terrorist networks. And it's just that in the last 20 years, more and more, they're actually directing them overtly to create the terrorist acts that justify the FBI's existence and allow it to get billions of dollars in money. And the CIA is the same way. They don't want peace. Just like the DEA doesn't want decriminalization. These huge, massive bureaucracies, which get the green light from Congress, just keep fueling all the problems that they are there to correct. And they do it for their own bureaucratic reasons. And they don't care if a couple of Americans get blown up in Boston. They don't even care if 3,000 Americans get killed in the trade tower catastrophe. And all this is really, as my research has indicated, completely understood at the highest levels, the National Security Council, the industries that run the United States, that this is the status quo. And they allow these bureaucracies to continue to do these things because it entrenches the ruling class. It allows them to make their billions of dollars and to live their life of ease and never actually have to deal with any of these problems themselves. So, that's the way American society and civilization is organized, and that's the way it is. And it's getting harder and harder for the average people that Hillary Clinton wants to represent when she becomes president, to actually make a dent in this system. Yeah. And I'll have no answers for that. I'm floundering like anybody else and as infuriated and frustrated as anybody else. And like everybody else, I'm glad in the evening to watch a TV show and forget about it.
And all we can do is keep pushing forward.
Yeah. You know, I mean, and an hour or two a day, or, I just encourage people to try to spend a little bit every day, trying to inform yourself, try to teach yourself to be rational and objective and to look at things objectively. Don't line up with Fox. Don't line up with MSNBC. Try to find some way to find a center in your life, and from that point, just be rational about things and try to to some extent understand what's going on, and then do some little thing about it. You'll have to do it 24 hours a day or every day out of the week, but if we don't make an effort to change ourselves first, we can't even begin to change society.
Okay, well, we're at the end of the show. How can people find you? What do you want to plug?
Just go to douglasvalentine.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter if you want to harass me on Twitter, yes, just send me a tweet. If you want to say something complimentary, say it on Facebook. If you want to give me a hard time, do it on Twitter where we have less words to deal with. If you feel like studying these subjects, then buy my books. But it takes to get to this point, like where you're at, Ed, or I'm at. You got to pick a subject and study it.
Yeah.
And you got to get to know it, and you got to educate yourself the way you would if you were going to go to college. It just takes some effort.
And I would definitely recommend if people can actually listen to those tape recorded interviews, like you said, online. My God, that is so valuable.
It's a great resource.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, people actually criticize me for things that the CIA guys say on their tapes. It's like, hey man, I didn't say it. I wrote about it in the book, but they said it. So, but it's interesting and humanizing, because you don't get to hear CIA people talk. They don't let them anymore. It's very rare that you actually hear a CIA officer let his guard down and tell you the facts. But if you want to hear that and experience and listen to these tapes, and once you understand that they're people, CIA officers, DEA agents, cops who are facing off people in Ferguson, that essentially they're just like you. You can't really begin to see where you fit into it. And how it's all really just a problem of people, and how all of us have to make a change.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a link to those tape recordings on the Opperman Report blog, and there's going to be links to all his books and websites and everything like that. Will be up on the blog. Doug, thank you so much. Okay.
It was my pleasure. Yeah. I'm really glad to meet you.
Yeah.
And hear the things that you said. You're a great interviewer, and you let me talk.
Oh, no, yeah, I let you talk. But I'm going to beg you to come back, and anytime you have something comes up you want to talk about, just give me a call. I'll put you on right away.
I'll take you up on that opportunity for sure.
Thank you, sir.